Women's Suffrage, the 19th Amendment by Sydney Salin. What was the main problem? Many men believed in the idea that the only true woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. Women disagreed with this idea. They wanted to be on an equal plane as men. After the 14th and 15th Amendment were both passed, women decided to stand up for a change because it was clear that it wasn't just men that deserved to be defined as the only citizen. The women no longer watched this madness. Instead, they stepped up to fight for their rights. In 1840, after finding out that women weren't allowed to attend the World's Anti-Slavery Convention, they started to create their women's suffrage movement. In 1850, there was the first National Women's Rights Convention held in Worcester, Massachusetts. In 1861 through 1865, during the Civil War, efforts for the suffrage movement come to a halt. Women put their energies towards the war instead. In 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. decided to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1871, Victoria Woodhull addresses the House Judiciary Committee, arguing women's rights to vote under the 14th Amendment. The anti-suffrage party is founded. For and against women's suffrage groups. So a group that formed was the National Women's Suffrage Association. Their association was to work for women's suffrage in the United States. Its main leaders were Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Another group that formed was the anti-women's suffrage movement. This was a group of people that were countering the social movement of women's suffrage. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony cast her ballot for Ulysses S. in the presidential election and was arrested and brought to trial in Rochester, New York. 15 other women were arrested for illegally voting. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment is proposed to the U.S. Congress. When the 19th Amendment passes, 41 years later, it was worded exactly the same as this 1878 amendment was worded. Two of the most popular women's suffrage parties were then formed. The first president was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The movement focuses efforts on securing suffrage at the state level, not country. In 1890, Wyoming, the first state, adapts to women's suffrage. The movement takes off. Even though some states weren't accepting women's suffrage, over time, more and more states began to. States like Utah, Oregon, Nevada, Montana, Kansas, Idaho, and Washington State all started to adopt women's suffrage. This was a huge deal at the time. In 1913, suffragists organized a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. The parade was the first major suffrage spectacle organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The first woman is elected to Congress and is seated in the United States House of Representatives. Some of the important women at the time were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Jeannette Rankin, and Lucretia Mott. Susan B. Anthony was an American social reformer and women's rights activist. She played a huge role in the women's suffrage movement. She was one of the founders of National Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the leader of the women's rights movement in the United States. She was the main force behind the popular Seneca Falls Convention. She was one of the first presidents of the National Suffrage Association. Jeannette Rankin. In 1916, Jeannette Rankin was the first woman to hold federal office in the United States. She was elected to the House of Representatives as a Republican from Montana. Lucretia Mott was an American abolitionist, women's suffrage activist, and social reformer. In 1840, Mott and a bunch of other women were excluded from the World's Anti-Slavery Convention. Because of this, she decided to take action. She created the idea of reforming the position of women in society. Here's a picture of all the 4 women that were just explained in the previous slide. The beginning of a new era. On June 4th, 1919, the Congress ratified the 19th Amendment. A year later, on August 18th, 1920, 3/4 of the state legislators passed the 19th Amendment. Every American woman won the full right to vote. On November 2nd of 1920, more than 8 million women across the United States voted in elections for the first time ever in United States history. Last but not least, here's a funny meme.